6 months ago, a village went up in flames. Homes were lost, families upended, and the nation got a stark warning about our perilous climate future. But has anything changed? Have we heeded the warning? Hello and welcome to the Climate Show with me, Tom Heap, and this week we're in Wennington, the village in Essex just to the east of London that was ravaged by wildfire. It was the day last summer when the mercury hit 40 degrees for the first time, and I, like many, was watching the television, looking at pictures of this place on fire and thinking, so this is England now? Not just California or Portugal. Our settlements are now threatened by extreme heat and the danger of wildfire. Now, 6 months on, we'll be meeting some of the residents who fled the flames and also asking whether we've done enough to prepare for more summers of extreme heat. And I've been talking to Chris Skidmore, the Tory insider asked by the government to review their carbon-cutting plans. Some thought he might water down the ambition to meet net zero. Turns out he's called for tougher action.
There is a false narrative that net zero is some kind of green project, a religion that's going to somehow make us colder and poorer. And what we found actually is that Westminster and Whitehall are behind the curve.
But first, remember July the 19th last year? Fires on the ground, smoke in the air and potentially deadly air temperatures. Let's meet those affected to see how they're getting on and also ask what's been done to adapt to avoid others meeting the same fate.
It was the most scariest day.
That day was absolutely awful. Our kids have lost everything.
You would never ever forget it in your lifetime.
For the villagers of Wennington, it will be hard to forget the summer of 2022 and everything that was lost.
We had furniture in here, a TV down here.
So all these scorch marks on the ground represent where stuff used to sit?
Yeah, there was a rattan corner unit here and a coffee table completely gone.
The flames spared most of Dave and Robbie's home. 19 nearby properties were completely destroyed.
That somebody said the cottages are on alight, and then that's when we thought, no. We were watching the fire creep along the cottages, and then the smoke started coming out of our roof, and we just went, it's gone.
The sense that it was such a lottery is stark. A few cottages down, Sophie and her family were less fortunate.
So my house is number 4, which was the White House.
And what's happening to it today?
It's been demolished today from the back.
How do you feel?
Devastated. You just didn't think in a million years that something like this would happen.
How does it feel 6 months on?
It's still awful, really. I mean, especially as we are still in a hostel. We got put in a hostel straight after. And 6 months on, we are still in a hostel and the council not really doing anything about it. They've told us we've got to stay in there for up to 2 years.
Where we used to look forward to the summers, they're going to have a little bit of fear behind them now, because we've seen what happened once and we'll all be living here fear that it'll happen again.
This needs to go to Parliament. This needs to be a compulsory order.
To do what?
Install fire breaks, not just in Wennington village, all over the country. It's the future, the young people growing up. This is what they've got.
There were over 24,000 wildfires in England between June and August last year, more than 4 times the same period in the previous year. As it happens, Wennington has a fire station in the village. Not that it helped that day, as the crews were already out dousing flames elsewhere, just as their whole station nearly went up.
Fire then affected the fences, entered the grounds of the fire station, swept across this grass area here, as you can see. Got very close to our diesel tank, and the crews worked extremely hard, and they stopped the fire literally 2 foot from the diesel tank.
Wow, so that big tank over there is full of diesel?
Yeah, that's got 5,000 litres of diesel in there.
And what would have happened if that had gone?
Definitely the station would have been damaged. We've got the specialist appliances in the background there. They would have at least been damaged or completely destroyed if that diesel tank had gone up.
So do we now need to be aware that our gardens could be a tinderbox?
And my crews here at Wennington Fire Station, they're producing a fire safety leaflet. Obviously we do fire safety in the home leaflets, but we want to give information to residents about fire safety in the garden. This would include about keeping your hedges trimmed down, taking away any fire loading, items in your garden that you don't need, make sure they go to the correct recycling place, old gas cylinders that you don't need, and even safe use of barbecues. We've been ensuring that the fire breaks within these parks, between the houses and the country park itself, are being looked at and are being put back to a proper fire break to protect the properties.
The government told us they are working on wildfire risk plans, and the Forestry Commission now carries out vegetation fire training. Do you think you've been able to do enough to support the residents? One lady we've spoken to, still in a hostel, not very happy.
We've been here literally from the day of the fires, and we've been permanently down here. Obviously, immediately after the fire, we was down here almost 24/7.
But the support they've provided so far has come at a cost of £100,000, and they've had to foot the whole bill.
When we had the fires here, obviously all the work we did was a cost to the council, and we've actually written to both the GLA and the government for help and support, and sadly it didn't come.
The village of Wennington and its 300 souls have become a symbol for the dangers of climate change, and the scars are not just on the buildings.
Although we are lucky, we've also got a little bit of survivor's guilt, because all of our friends in the rest of the block have got nothing.
Global warming, everyone's talking about it. It's not coming, it's here. It's here. And things need to be put in place.
Well, for more on this, I went to Westminster to catch up with Chris Stark. He's Chief Executive of the Climate Change Committee, the independent body that advises government on how to combat and adapt to climate change. Where were you and what were you thinking on July the 19th last year?
I was on a train in the north of England, and it was a classic example of the problems that come with high temperatures, because the train's air conditioning failed. So I was in this cooker, essentially, travelling through the north of England, coming down from where I live in Scotland to ironically see a project that was about this challenge of net zero, so how you might generate hydrogen. So I suppose I was kind of in the middle of several stories about climate.
Yeah, and did you feel as you were on that train, kind of this is a one-off or this is the shape of things to come?
Well, sadly, I did feel it was the shape of things to come, but I think everyone else on the train thought it was a one-off, and I think there's a story in that just, I'm afraid the kind of summer that we had last year is going to be a normal summer by the middle of this century. Increasingly, it is a normal event to have heat of that high heat that we experience. So we need to get our heads around that, which is a major part of the challenge.
You've done some reports about adaptation, which have been a little bit critical of the slow progress. Tell me where we are with that.
Well, we have two challenges in climate. We have reducing emissions, which gets all of the attention in politics, but the other one is adaptation, which is a difficult word, but it's how well we adapt to the risks that we know are there from climate change. And I'm afraid governments across the UK are just not stepping up to that. So we have various plans for adaptation, but they don't really amount to a hill of beans.
Give me a few examples of what you'd like to see.
Well, top of my list actually is linked to the question of overheating and the heat that we face now every summer. And we need to think about what we do with buildings. So last summer during the heat wave, we probably had 2,000 heat-related deaths in this country, an astonishing figure. We've seen that before. And that's from poorly ventilated buildings that aren't prepared for that kind of heat. The kind of heats that you might find commonly on the continent when you go on holiday is the kind of thing that we'll have here in London. So we need buildings that are well adapted for that. So that would be the top of my list.
But just briefly on that, I guess you'd also say it's key that we don't air condition our way out of that problem, because that's a climate change cause itself.
Correct. If we just install lots of air conditioning units, we actually create a bigger problem, which is higher energy use and more heat in our cities from all that air conditioning use. What we need is well-conditioned buildings, things like simple stuff like shutters on the outside of windows, which we don't commonly build.
What about the actual fire risk? Because that was the extraordinary thing. I was looking at the telly, watching this in July, thinking, hang on a minute, this is England, this is Britain, this isn't Australia or California.
Yeah, I was surprised too, and I suppose I shouldn't have been. I mean, you see, with wildfire risk is now a big thing in the North America and across Europe, but it's here in the UK as well. I don't think we've really started to think through the adaptation needs there. We have to think about things like fire breaks. We've got to think about what we do to make sure that our buildings, our urban conurbations are well protected from that kind of risk when it comes by every year.
So the fire breaks would actually be saying to landowners that you mustn't put brush or basically potential tinder that close to buildings. Is that the issue?
Yes, that's right. That kind of approach is something that you don't see in common practice, but we'll need to think that through properly in this country. Because
all our fire regulations, and there are lots, are nearly all to do with the fire risk from inside your home, not from outside.
I don't think we have a regulatory environment that has really thought through at all the fact that wildfire risk is now a very common occurrence in this country, and it will get worse. It's an important thing about what climate change brings is it intensifies these existing risks. So the kind of experience we had here in London is the kind of experience I'm afraid we're going to have every year, so we've got to prepare for that.
What would you actually like government to do? Are there some regulations or some laws that need to be passed to make us, as you would say, more resilient to these extremes?
Well, there's not a simple answer to that, but it starts really with the government taking seriously this challenge of climate change and thinking through properly the change in the climate that's coming next. Now, in the work that we've done, we've looked at two scenarios. For an optimistic scenario where the world warms by 2 degrees centigrade, and another scenario with a pessimistic scenario where we're up closer to 4 degrees centigrade. In that range is the likely outcome, I'm afraid, and we're not planning for that. So across the piece, we need the government to pass that through the lens of policy, think through what policies we would need for that 2 to 4 degree world, and start putting policies around it.
For more from Wennington and what it might teach us about how to adapt to climate change, check out the latest episode of the Climate Cast by scanning the QR code on your screen right now. And I'll be back after the break with a conversation with former Energy Minister Chris Skidmore, who's just done a review of our net zero policies and has some tough things to say to the government. But first, we've just got time to answer one of your questions, and it comes from Lily. She asks, who determines what land to destroy when building a solar farm? And is there an environmental impact study done?
Thanks for the question, Lily. Solar farms can degrade the environment, but if done well and in the right place, they can actually improve nature. Our research at Lancaster shows that you can locate and manage solar farms to boost pollinators, potentially increasing crop yields. Many people determine where solar farms are built. The landowner has to agree, and developers have to apply for planning permission, and anyone can comment on a planning application. The local planning committee, who take into account all the comments, make the final decision, unless it's a very large solar farm, and then the planning inspectorate, which is part of central government, decide. Several environmental documents are required for planning applications, and soon every development will need to show biodiversity net gain, which should prevent any solar farm from destroying the land.
Welcome back to Wennington, where we heard how residents suffered in last year's wildfires, and also how, as a nation, there's scant evidence we're adapting to more extreme weather. Well, while we all boiled back then, the Conservative Party was consumed with a leadership race where net zero became a political issue. So, how did all of this...
I want you to know how sad I am to be giving up the best job in the world.
Let me tell you a story.
Do you have the numbers to make the final two?
Turn into this.
The climate clock stops for no one.
After Liz Truss emerged victorious from the upheaval of the Tory leadership race, she faced pressure from the right of her party to water down or even drop the UK's net zero commitments. In response, former Energy Minister Chris Skidmore was asked to review the country's net zero pledge to make sure it was pro-business
and pro-growth.
Of course, Prime Minister Truss only survived 44 days in Downing Street.
I am resigning as leader of the Conservative Party.
But the review lived on.
The longer we delay, the narrower our choices to deliver on net zero become.
And now Prime Minister Sunak has to deal with the renewed call to go faster on net zero. With findings officially published, I caught up with the author, Conservative MP Chris Skidmore.
There is a false narrative that net zero is some kind of green project, a religion that's going to somehow make us colder and poorer. And what we found actually is that Westminster and Whitehall are behind the curve. There are companies and organisations, particularly in industrial areas, in the north and the Midlands, who want to get on with the job, who see the international opportunity of investing in renewables and clean technology in order to deliver a profit margin.
Give me some concrete examples of what you've called for.
So we've called for 10-year missions, because one of the key recommendations of the report also, if you want to do it in an affordable way, don't just get on with the job, you've got to plan ahead. You've got to be able to deliver and implement net zero. It's no good having just the targets in place. So we've said that we should have missions on, for instance, solar, on onshore wind, on nuclear, on hydrogen, that set out a pathway.
Sorry to interrupt you, just on solar. Give me an example of what you're calling for. I think it's more on buildings, possibly fields as well.
Yeah, so I'm calling for a rooftop revolution. That when it comes to solar, it's the cheapest way in which we can deliver on our renewable commitments. And we've suggested 70 gigawatts of energy by 2035.
Should be delivered comparison, how much do we have now on roofs?
14
so
gigawatts. So
it's 5 times.
It's 5 times as much, potentially over 200 million extra panels that would need to be installed in the UK.
Onshore wind?
Onshore wind, we come down in favour of onshore wind. We believe that the obviously key to that is buying in local consent. So we're trying to come up with new ways in which we can demonstrate that communities can be paid back, not just in terms of pounds and pence, but maybe buying in equity into the projects, maybe being sort of purchasing community halls.
It always strikes me with onshore wind, it's a question of making it belong to the community, making it feel it's theirs rather than imposed from the outside.
Yeah, absolutely. And having that sort of consent in place is critical to net zero. I'm not some kind of iconoclast who sort of devoutly believes in net zero. You've got to be able to work with those individuals and communities who are concerned about the transition and make sure that they are aware that this is going to make them warmer and richer and benefit their local community and not be detrimental.
What about the grid? Because I often hear from people who are trying to get renewable energy projects off the ground that the grid just isn't up to it.
Yeah.
Is it?
And that's absolutely right. So grid is a key message. We've got this sort of antiquated 1960s grid where we see not just the lack of capacity on the grid and the need to build out future transmission lines, there's a huge waiting list. There's delays. There's community projects that are waiting till 2032 to get their grid slot.
You're a Conservative, you're an MP that's standing down the next election. In some ways, you're an insider. What are the chances of what you recommend actually happening?
And I'm also a pragmatist. So when it comes to the review, we've made 129 recommendations in a 340-page report. Some of those recommendations are long-term by their very nature. They need to set out that mission-based pathway, which is why it's called Mission Zero. But I've also got a framework of 25 by 2025, 25 key recommendations that I think the government can do now, get on with the job and deliver in this administration.
So your fingers crossed that they could actually take some of this on?
I think we've seen a big shift over the last couple of months. So we've seen an amendment go through that is going to allow for onshore wind, subject to local consent. We've seen the moratorium or the actual ban on fracking being restored. I think things are going in the right direction. And the UK government has done so much over the past to deliver on climate change. I just want to make sure they maintain that momentum and remain global leaders.
Thanks very much, Chris. That's enough questions from me. But before I let you go, I've got a question from a viewer, Stuart Strath D, who asked as part of our Q&A, how does what students are taught in schools and colleges need to change to ensure young people benefit from the opportunities identified in your review?
So when it comes to putting climate into schools on the agenda, on the curriculum, I know the government's thinking about introducing a new climate GCSE. Key priorities of that obviously looking at how we can develop the skills so they can go into the future green jobs that we need. We need about 400,000 new jobs, so training for those, absolutely vital. But I would say also, Rishi Sunak has prioritised maths. Actually, when it comes to renewable energy, demonstrating to people that energy that is renewable will make them a saving year on year on year as a cumulative impact is really important. So I would say it's not just about teaching climate, it's also about teaching the opportunities and the investment that comes as a result of net zero.
Well, as you can see, I'm back in Wennington now, and I've been joined by Sky's science and technology editor, Tom Clark, actually to talk about some of the stories away from here and what's been happening this week. It has actually been an unusually mild winter across Europe, including the UK, and that's had interesting impacts with regard to gas bills at a time of the Ukraine war.
Yeah, absolutely. So despite the cold snap we've had recently and we're having right now in the UK, it's been warm. You remember there were record high temperatures through much of Central and Eastern Europe through this winter as well. We've been incredibly lucky considering how bad things could have been given where gas prices are. That's absolutely right.
Because there were these forecasts, given the Ukraine war plus the fear of a cold winter, of astronomical gas prices, and that's what drove a lot of the fear in the summer and the government policy to put in a lot of help for homes and businesses.
That's right.
Luckily, they haven't got that high.
Wholesale prices are coming down. Now, bills are still astronomically high. They went up very, very, very high through the winter because of the impact of the war in Ukraine, and they're going to remain high for a while. But the latest analysis from energy analysts like Cornwall Insight, for example, predict that those wholesale prices are going to fall considerably, or they started falling already, they're going to fall considerably through the year. That is going to be a big break. Now, not directly for consumers. The average bill could still be close to £3,000 by the summer, but it is quite good news for the government because remember, they had an energy scheme to help support people beyond a £3,000 energy bill. So if bills are going to be below there, that's going to save the taxpayer a lot of money indeed, and that's going to be good news for our wider economy.
There was talk of tens of billions having to be put to this, and I guess those in the Treasury will be quite relieved that might not happen.
They will be enjoying the current temperatures a lot, I would predict, yes.
It is also the time of year when people go to the Alps, powerful financial people and other politicians to Davos. Now, there's been a bit of a row there about who's doing most, are we doing enough?
Absolutely. I mean, normally this is where, the global elites go to enjoy the skiing and sort of solve the world's problems, how they like to see it. This time they got a bit of a dressing down, actually. The UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, went there, and he said this many times before, but warned them that they are really the problem when it comes to solving the problem of climate change, the greatest threat that he's ever seen in his lifetime. He says they've got a lot more to do, singled out fossil fuel companies for not doing their part.
Just quite interesting there, because we've heard a lot about finance becoming the ally in the fight against climate change. Not there yet. Was that the message?
I very much think that is the message. Now, obviously, lots of big, powerful investment companies, hedge funds and the banks signed up to commitments at the Glasgow Climate Summit, said they were going to do everything, go beyond. But the NGOs are, of course, in Davos, reminding them that so far they're still investing far more in fossil fuel projects than they are in the clean economy.
Is that your lot?
But one more thing, tiny bit of good news. Scientists from the British Antarctica Survey, using satellite data, have found a new colony of emperor penguins in Antarctica. They're very precious. They're threatened by climate change. They found a new colony in a place they never knew them before, looking for guano deposits. Their droppings show up on the satellite images against the snow, and there's about 500 more than we knew before, so that's great news.
Love it. Ending on a bit of bird poo, who doesn't like that? Tom Clark, thank you very much indeed. Well, that's it from here in Wennington, which is probably a good job as the lights begin to fade. You can catch up with the Daily Climate Show weekdays at 3:30 and lots more climate news on the website or Sky News app.